Welcome back, everybody. The first thing we're going to do is check our answers for that little knowledge check we did. Make sure you have your notebook out to this page and make sure you correct these answers or fill in the ones if you hadn't done it yet. So I'm going to move myself up here. I didn't know I could do that. So you can see everything. So where is air moving down in this picture? Well, that should be pretty obvious. Both at F and at H, we have air moving down. So where's air moving up? It's moving up at G. Oh, by the way, where air is moving down, F and H, right? That's part of those Hadley cells. That should be where the deserts are, right? Remember that? So air moving up is at G. Wind, remember, wind is only where air is moving horizontally, so that should be B and D. Areas of high pressure, well, that's where air is moving down, adding to the pressure, the weight of the air. So that should be, again, well, not again, but A and E. That's areas of high pressure. Area of low pressure is wherever air should be moving up. So that is C. And where is precipitation likely? Remember, where do we get precipitation? Wherever air is moving up. So that's going to be C. And where is precipitation unlikely? Wherever air is moving down, that would be A and E. Those are those desert belts that we talked to you before if you did that activity. So make sure you get out your, this is the last one, well, the last note page for now. L, air masses, that should be in your notebook. If it's not, you can just write this out on a blank piece of paper. Most of you have your notebook though. So we're going to talk about the two qualities of air. If you think about air, how can you describe air? It really only has two qualities we talked about. One is temperature, and the other one is humidity. I mean, we can also talk about pressure, but we're just going to talk about temperature and humidity right now. So if you're, how can the temperature vary? Well, we can have warm air or we can have cold air. So we're making this very simple. Humidity can either be wet or dry. So if you notice, there's only 4 different ways of qualifying air in this situation. And so there's only going to be 4 combinations too. So how does air get warm, wet, dry, and cold? Well, it depends on where it's traveling from. If air is traveling over an ocean, how is that going to affect the air? Ocean. You might think it's warmer because oceans tend to be warm, but ocean really is going to make it wet, right? Because there's a lot of water above in the ocean. So anytime you have water over the ocean, coming from the ocean, it's going to be wet. If it's traveling over land, there's no water on the land, it's going to be dry, always. Air traveling over land or continental will be dry. By the way, maritime is a word that really just means ocean. Continental means land. So then we have the north and the south. Well, air coming from the north, where we live anyway, is polar air, and that is going to be cold because we know it's cold up in the north. If it's coming from the south, it's coming from the equator, it's going to be warm. So the trick here is to remembering that maritime air is wet, continental air is dry, polar air is cold, tropical air is warm. Now we can combine these terms and talk about the 4 different kinds of air. So we could have maritime polar air. That's what this M and the P stands for, maritime polar. So maritime is going to be wet, polar is cold, right? So we get cold, wet air. Wow, I didn't know I could make a little pointer. Look at that. So we have maritime, that's the wet, and we have polar, that's the cold. So what about continental polar? Well, continental is going to be dry. So now but we still have polar. So this is going to be cold, but dry air. So any air coming from the land that's from the north is going to be cold and dry. Maritime tropical. Maritime means ocean. That's going to be wet. Tropical is warm. So it's going to be warm and wet. And then the other combination we have is continental from the land, that's going to be dry, and tropical, that's going to be warm. So we have warm and dry air. So let's look into reality here and see what we got. Oh, and notice these terms here, MP, CP, MT, and CT. This matches these terms. So we don't have wet and cold. We have maritime and polar. So here are some examples of real air masses that we typically get in our country. So what about this air mass? What kind of air is this going to be? Is it over the ocean or is it over the land? Is it from the north or from the south? Let's think about it and let's write down what we think it is. Well, it's maritime and polar because it's from the ocean and it's from the north. And so the abbreviation for that is little m, big P, MP air. That's going to be cold, wet air. What about this air down here? What's that going to be like? Well, it's still over the ocean, so it's maritime. From the north or the south? From the south, so it's going to be tropical. It's warm, right? And so the letters we're going to write here are MT for maritime tropical. What about these right here? This air right here. Now it's blue, which means it's coming from the north, so it's going to be cold, right? So that's polar, but is it coming from the land or the ocean? It's coming from the land, so it'll be called the land. Call it continental, and it's going to be polar, so that is CP air, cold, dry air. Well, this one over here, it's the same thing, cold, dry air, so that's going to be the same thing as the last one. And then, what about this one here? This is going to be continental, because it's coming from the land. Tropical, because it's coming from the south, so we have that as CT. Couple more. Which one is this going to be? Should be the same as this one, right? Maritime polar, so that's MP. And then this one should be the same as this one. This is the kind of air we get a lot in the summertime, and that's why we get the kind of weather we do in the summertime, because it's warm from the ocean. So if it's maritime, it's going to be wet. That's where we get all our rain from. And tropical is warm, so it's going to be MT. So those are the 4 different kinds of air masses, and this is where they come from. And if you look over here, we can make some other guesses. Well, why is this part of the country so dry? Well, because it's getting a lot of its air from the interior of Mexico. Why is this part of the country so wet? Well, it's getting wet air from this cold ocean flow. So this explains a lot about weather, but we still have to learn a little bit more, and that'll be on our next activity.